I am Cassidy, 33 years old, and today my husband handed me an ultimatum that ended up costing him his entire future. We were at an upscale restaurant celebrating his parents' anniversary when he slammed his fist on the table and yelled, "Apologize to my mother right now or pack your bags and get out." I did not scream or cry. I simply slipped off my wedding ring, dropped it into his water glass, and booked a one-way flight to Switzerland with our 5-year-old son. What he did not know was that walking out that door was just the first step in a carefully orchestrated plan to dismantle his completely fabricated life. Before I reveal how his arrogant ultimatum triggered an absolute financial avalanche, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family to protect your peace. The confrontation happened at a notoriously overpriced French restaurant in downtown Chicago. The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft murmur of wealthy patrons died instantly when my husband Brandon raised his voice. Diners at adjacent tables lowered their forks, their eyes darting toward our corner booth. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on my lap, staring at the man I had been married to for 7 years. His face was flushed, a prominent vein throbbing near his temple as he desperately tried to play the commanding patriarch for his captive audience. That audience consisted of his mother Brenda, who was currently sipping her expensive wine with a venomous smirk. Beside her sat his sister Samantha, who was barely concealing her glee behind a silk napkin, and Jamal, Samantha's husband. Jamal was a sharp, impeccably dressed African-American corporate lawyer. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his drink with the casual arrogance of a man who loved treating family dinners like a courtroom, where he was always the presiding judge. "Cassidy, let us look at this logically," Jamal said, his deep baritone cutting through the heavy silence. He adjusted his tailored suit and shot me a condescending smile. "It is basic contract law. You eat the truffles, you pay the piper. Brandon pays your mortgage, so the absolute least you can do is cover Brenda and Richard's anniversary dinner with your little freelance consulting hobby." My little hobby. I repeated the words softly, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. Brenda slid the black leather check folder across the white linen tablecloth. It stopped exactly 1 inch from my plate. The bold printed numbers glared up at me, showing a total of $4,250. "Do not act like it is a hardship, Cassidy," Brenda sneered, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Brandon breaks his back to put a roof over your head. You work from home in your pajamas, playing on your laptop all day. It is time you proved you are actually useful to this family instead of just leeching off my son." I looked at the bill, then at my husband. Brandon crossed his arms and puffed out his chest. He was a mid-level project manager at a mid-tier tech firm, making a decent but modest salary. He genuinely believed he was the absolute king of the castle. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that my little freelance hobby was actually my role as a director of mergers and acquisitions strategy for a top-tier Swiss investment firm. I did not just play on my laptop. I brokered massive acquisitions across international markets. My annual bonuses alone could have bought the entire restaurant we were sitting in. I had kept my wealth deliberately hidden in offshore trusts for years, playing the role of the modest, budget-conscious wife just to protect Brandon's incredibly fragile masculinity. I let him pay the mortgage so he could feel like a provider. I let his family look down on me because correcting them was simply not worth the exhausting arguments. But tonight, the game was finally over. "I am not paying over $4,000 for a dinner I did not even want to attend, Brenda," I said quietly, locking eyes with my mother-in-law. "Especially not after you spent the last 2 hours critiquing my parenting, my clothes, and my career." "How dare you speak to my mother like that?" Brandon barked, slamming his fist on the table again and making the silverware jump. "You are embarrassing me, Cassidy. You are pathetic. Either you put your card in that folder and apologize to my mother right now, or you can pack your bags and get out of my house." Samantha snickered, leaning into Jamal's shoulder. "Careful, Brandon. She might actually have to sleep on the streets. We all know she does not have a dime to her name." Jamal chuckled, tapping his expensive luxury watch. I can draft the eviction notice pro bono if you need it, man. A strange, absolute calm washed over me. It was the clarity of a woman who had just been handed the exact excuse she needed to execute a contingency plan that had been quietly sitting in the dark for 3 entire months. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or try to defend myself. I slowly stood up, smoothing the skirt of my dress. I reached for my left hand and slid the 2-carat diamond engagement ring off my finger. The metal felt heavy, burdened by years of gaslighting and emotional labor. I held it over Brandon's water glass and simply let it go. It dropped to the bottom with a quiet, finalized clink. Brandon's smug expression faltered. "What are you doing?" "Taking your advice," I said, picking up my purse. I looked down at the 4 faces staring up at me in stunned silence. "I am getting out of your house. Happy anniversary, Brenda. Enjoy the bill," Cassidy Brandon yelled, his voice cracking as I turned on my heel. "If you walk out that door, I am cutting off the joint credit cards. Do you hear me? You will not last 3 days out there." I did not even look back. I strode past the host stand, pushed through the heavy glass doors, and stepped out into the crisp, biting Chicago night. The cold air filled my lungs, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt entirely dangerously free. I pulled out my phone and ordered a premium rideshare, bypassing the shared family account and paying with a corporate card Brandon did not even know existed. As I slid into the back of the sleek black SUV, I dialed my nanny. "Maria, it is Cassidy. I need you to pack Leo's travel bags right now, just his favorite clothes and his tablet. I am on my way and we are leaving." I hung up the phone and checked my watch. Knowing Brenda's penchant for post-dinner espresso and complaining I had exactly 45 minutes before Brandon made it back to the suburbs to make good on his threat. 45 minutes to sever my ties, grab my 5-year-old son, and vanish into a life they could not possibly comprehend. The premium rideshare pulled up to the driveway of our 4-bedroom suburban home, just as a heavy sheet of rain began to wash over the neighborhood. I told the driver to keep the engine running and jogged up the front steps. Maria was waiting in the brightly lit foyer. Her eyes were wide with maternal concern as she held Leo's small rolling suitcase and his favorite green stuffed dinosaur. Leo was sound asleep on the living room sofa, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was shifting. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Cassidy?" Maria asked, stepping forward to help me shrug off my damp coat. He was so tired after his bath, I just let him rest. "Everything is perfectly fine, Maria." "Better than fine," I said. I reached into my purse and handed her a thick envelope containing 3 months of her salary in cash as a severance package. "Thank you for taking such wonderful care of him. I need you to leave through the back gate right now. Do not answer any calls or texts from Brandon tonight." Maria nodded silently. She was a smart woman and understood the gravity of the situation without needing the ugly details. She slipped out the back door, and I moved like a ghost through the house I had painstakingly decorated over the last few years. I did not take any of the expensive furniture, the imported art, or the high-end electronics. I did not pack a single item that Brandon could ever claim he paid for with his mid-level salary. I walked straight into the master bedroom, pulled a sleek silver suitcase from the back of the closet, and packed only my essential clothes, my passport, and a locked encrypted hard drive containing all my offshore financial ledgers. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Brandon. "You actually left. You are pathetic. I just transferred every single cent out of the joint checking account. Let us see how far you get without my money to fund your little life. Beg me, and maybe I will let you sleep in the guest room tonight." I stared at the glowing screen, a cold, predatory smile curving my lips. The joint account he was so fiercely guarding held exactly $18,450. It was mostly his recent paycheck and a few $1,000s I had purposefully left in there to keep up the illusion of our shared middle-class existence. He genuinely thought he was starving me out. He thought he had severed my only financial lifeline. He did not know that 3 months ago I had uncovered his darkest, most arrogant secret. It happened on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. I had been looking for our tax documents in his home office when I stumbled upon a thick manila folder shoved carelessly behind his heavy wooden filing cabinet. Inside were the finalized signed documents for a home equity line of credit. Brandon had secretly taken out a $150,000 second mortgage against our house. The house I had legally allowed him to put solely in his name years ago to soothe his ego because he wanted to feel like the ultimate provider. He used that equity to cover the down payment and co-sign a luxury downtown condo. The deed to that condo had a second name on it. A 24-year-old marketing assistant from his office named Chloe. He was not just having a cliché affair. He was actively and financially leveraging our family home to play wealthy sugar daddy to his young mistress. When I found those papers, I did not confront him. I did not scream, cry, or throw plates against the wall. I simply sat in his leather chair, quietly closed the folder, and placed it exactly where I found it. Then I picked up my phone and called my wealth manager in Switzerland. I spent the next 90 days systematically liquidating the few domestic assets tied to my name. I legally and quietly funneled everything into an untouchable ironclad offshore trust based in Zurich. My net worth sat comfortably at $45 million, protected by layers of international corporate law. Brandon was holding $18,000 and a ticking time bomb of toxic debt. He had built his own financial guillotine, and I was simply stepping out of the way before the blade dropped. I went into the living room and scooped up my sleeping son. Leo stirred slightly, wrapping his small arms around my neck and burying his face in my shoulder. I grabbed our suitcases and headed for the front door. I pulled my house keys from my pocket, dropped them into the metal mailbox mounted on the wall, and pulled the front door shut until I heard the heavy deadbolt click into place. Back in the waiting SUV, I gave the driver our new destination. O'Hare International Airport, please. Terminal 5. The car merged onto the slick highway, the vibrant city lights blurring and reflecting off the rain-streaked windows. I settled back into the leather seat, holding Leo close to my chest. My phone illuminated the dark cabin with another notification. This time it was a message in the family group chat from Jamal. Cassidy, as Brandon's legal counsel, I highly advise you to return to the marital home immediately. Abandonment of the property can and will be used against you in divorce proceedings. Do not make this messy. You definitely cannot afford my hourly rate. I let out a soft laugh, the sound startling the driver slightly. Jamal thought he was dealing with a frightened, penniless housewife who did not understand the law. He thought his American corporate law degree gave him jurisdiction and power over a woman who had already shifted the battlefield entirely out of his reach. He was threatening me with abandonment of a property that was a financial sinkhole. The sheer absurdity of his legal posturing almost made me pity him. I locked my phone screen and tucked it into my coat pocket. The black SUV glided smoothly through the rain-soaked streets of Chicago, leaving the suburban trap I had called home further behind with every passing mile. I was no longer the quiet, accommodating wife. I was a strategist executing a flawless exit. We pulled up to the curb at O'Hare International Airport Terminal 5. The automatic doors slid open to reveal the bustling departure hall. I hoisted Leo against my hip and grabbed the handle of my sleek silver suitcase. I bypassed the massive winding lines of economy travelers and headed straight for the exclusive entrance reserved specifically for international first-class passengers. A polished airline representative greeted me with a warm smile. "Good evening, madam. May I see your passports?" I handed over our documents, including my heavy metal corporate identification card. The representative's eyes widened fractionally as she noted my elite global status with the airline, a quiet perk of managing billion-dollar European corporate acquisitions. "Welcome back, Miss Cassidy. I see you and your son are flying first class to Zurich tonight. I just need to verify one additional document since you are traveling internationally with a minor without his father present. Do you happen to have a travel consent form?" I offered a serene smile and unzipped the side compartment of my tote bag. I pulled out a crisp notarized document and slid it smoothly across the marble counter. "Here you go. It is a blanket travel consent form granting me unilateral permission to take Leo out of the country indefinitely. The agent reviewed the signature, and the raised notary seal nodded her immediate approval and handed it back with our boarding passes. Thank you, Miss Cassidy. You are all set. Please enjoy the VIP lounge until boarding begins. As we walked toward the private security screening area, I allowed myself a brief moment to revel in the absolute perfection of that single piece of paper. Acquiring Brandon's signature on a legally binding international travel consent form had been ridiculously easy. He was a man who prided himself on delegating all domestic and educational responsibilities to me because his job was supposedly far too demanding. Exactly 1 month ago, I had walked into our living room while he was deeply engrossed in a Sunday night football game. He had a beer in one hand and was yelling loudly at the television. I carried a wooden clipboard stacked with 5 different brightly colored papers from Leo's kindergarten class. "Hey, I need you to sign these permission slips for Leo's school," I had said, keeping my tone light and mildly annoyed, exactly how I always sounded when dealing with mundane household chores. They have a field trip to the local zoo, a pizza day authorization, and a few health forms. They are due tomorrow morning. Brandon had groaned, rolling his eyes as he snatched a pen from his pocket. He did not read a single word. He just flipped through the pages, hastily scribbling his signature at the bottom of each one. "Just handle this stuff, Cassidy," he had complained, handing the clipboard back without even looking away from the flashing screen. "You know I hate doing paperwork. My brain is completely fried from dealing with actual corporate contracts all week." I had taken the clipboard back, hiding my triumphant smirk. Buried right in the middle of those neon kindergarten forms was the formal blanket travel consent document. I had taken it to a discreet downtown notary the very next day, making it an ironclad legal shield. Brandon had literally signed away his right to stop me from taking our son across the globe, all because he could not be bothered to miss 3 minutes of a football game. I settled into the private VIP lounge, guiding a groggy Leo to a plush velvet sofa in a quiet corner overlooking the tarmac. I ordered him a glass of warm milk and fresh fruit. He rubbed his eyes, looking around the luxurious space with sleepy curiosity. "Mommy, where are we?" he mumbled. "We are going on a huge adventure, sweetie," I whispered gently, stroking his soft hair. "We are going to fly on a giant airplane and wake up in a beautiful place with massive mountains and snow." Leo smiled, easily pacified by the promise of an adventure, and curled back up against the cushions. As he drifted back to sleep, I pulled my phone from my pocket. The 45 minutes had officially passed. Brandon had clearly made it back to the empty house in the suburbs. I had 14 missed calls from Brandon, 6 from Brenda, and a fresh barrage of text messages in the family group chat. I opened the chat, watching the frantic, arrogant messages pile up in real time. Brandon wrote, "You actually left the keys in the mailbox. You took my son. You are a dead woman, Cassidy. Get your broke self back here right now before I call the police." Brenda added, "I told you she was unstable, Brandon. This is what happens when you marry a woman with no career and no discipline. She is probably sitting at a cheap motel crying right now." Jamal chimed in next. "Cassidy, listen to me very carefully. You have exactly 1 hour to return the child to his legal residence. If you do not, I will personally file parental kidnapping charges tomorrow morning. I am a corporate lawyer, but I know enough family law to ensure you never see Leo again. You have no money for a legal defense. Surrender now, and Brandon might let you walk away with joint custody." I stared at the messages, feeling an overwhelming wave of sweet victory. They truly believed I was a helpless, penniless woman cowering in the rain. The boarding announcement for the first-class flight to Zurich echoed softly through the lounge speakers. It was time. I picked up my phone and typed out my final response to the family group chat. I made sure my words were precise, sharp, and absolutely devastating. "I am not coming back, Brandon. Enjoy the empty house while you still can. And good luck explaining the $150,000 second mortgage you secretly took out to buy a luxury condo for your 24-year-old mistress to your mother. I am sure Jamal can handle the inevitable bank foreclosure on the house pro bono. Consider this my formal resignation from your miserable family. Do not attempt to contact me. My lawyers will be in touch. Goodbye. I hit send. I watched the little indicators show that Brandon, Brenda, Samantha, and Jamal had all read the message instantly. I could practically feel the oxygen being sucked out of whatever room they were standing in. I did not wait to see the frantic, panic-stricken replies that I knew were currently being typed out by trembling fingers. I pressed the button to activate airplane mode. The cellular signal cut out, severing my connection to their toxic world completely and permanently. I slipped the phone into my designer bag, picked up my sleeping son, and walked gracefully toward the boarding gate, stepping onto the plane that would carry us directly into our new magnificent life. As the massive commercial jet taxied down the runway and lifted smoothly into the stormy Chicago sky, I leaned back against the plush leather seat of my private first-class suite. Leo was already fast asleep in the suite next to mine, tucked comfortably under a heavy cashmere blanket. The flight attendant handed me a glass of vintage champagne. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the crisp liquid wash away the last remaining traces of my suffocating suburban nightmare. While I was soaring thousands of feet above the Atlantic Ocean, leaving my old life completely behind, I knew exactly what was happening back on the ground. I had spent 7 years studying Brandon, dissecting his predictable reactions, his inflated ego, and his desperate need for his mother's approval. I would later learn through a combination of frantic legal filings and a digital paper trail exactly how my husband spent his first night as a supposedly victorious single man. When my final message hit the family group chat, exposing his secret second mortgage and his young mistress, the silence in that empty house must have been completely deafening. Brandon stood in the middle of the living room staring at his phone screen in absolute shock. But men like Brandon do not process guilt or accountability. They process threats to their ego. Within minutes, his shock contorted into defensive, irrational rage. He immediately turned to the two people who enabled his toxic behavior the most, his mother Brenda and his brother-in-law Jamal. Brenda instantly went into full denial mode. She assured her golden boy that I was simply lying, making up wild accusations out of sheer desperation because I had been kicked out of the house. Jamal, ever the arrogant corporate lawyer, backed her up completely. He told Brandon that my message was nothing but a classic, pathetic bluff from a woman who had just realized she had absolutely no leverage. They convinced each other that I was sitting in a cheap diner somewhere, fabricating financial terms I did not even understand just to scare them. To prove his absolute dominance over the situation, Brandon proudly pulled out his smartphone and opened his banking app. He held the bright screen up for his mother and Jamal to see. He showed them the $18,450 he had hastily transferred from our joint checking account into his newly opened private solo account earlier that evening. He bragged about how he had completely cut off my financial supply. He boasted that I had no income, no savings, and absolutely zero access to credit. In his mind, he had executed a masterstroke of financial warfare. He genuinely believed that grabbing a measly 18 grand was the ultimate checkmate. He stood in the living room he could no longer afford, surrounded by furniture I had secretly paid for, puffing his chest out like a conqueror standing over a vanquished enemy. He told his family that I would be calling him begging for basic grocery money before the weekend was over. He proclaimed that by transferring that cash he had decisively won the ultimate war. Jamal fed directly into Brandon's dangerous delusion. Pacing the hardwood floors in his expensive suit, Jamal assured his brother-in-law that the legal system would crush me entirely. He promised to draft an aggressive divorce petition first thing Monday morning. Jamal declared they would file for full custody of Leo, citing my sudden departure as proof of mental instability and child endangerment. He practically rubbed his hands together at the thought of destroying me in court. Jamal confidently explained that since I was unemployed and destitute, the judge would force me to cover Brandon's legal fees once I inevitably lost. He told Brandon that because the house deed was solely in Brandon's name, I had absolutely no legal right to the property anyway. Jamal completely ignored basic marital property laws in Illinois, assuming his corporate background made him an infallible expert in family court. They spent the rest of the night drinking my expensive whiskey, celebrating my supposed demise and congratulating themselves on getting rid of a useless, burdensome wife. Brandon went to sleep that night in the master bedroom, feeling like an absolute titan of industry. He thought he had successfully hidden his infidelity, secured his finances, and put his unruly wife perfectly in her place. He even sent a late-night text message to his young, naive mistress, assuring her that his annoying wife was finally out of the picture and that their luxury downtown condo was entirely secure. It was a spectacular illusion of victory. He was holding onto a fistful of cash while standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. He felt powerful because he controlled the narrative within his own toxic family bubble. Brenda had kissed his cheek before leaving, telling him he was a strong man for putting his foot down. Samantha had sent a follow-up text telling him he was incredibly brave and far better off without a lazy freeloader pulling him down. He had absolutely no idea that the $18,000 he was guarding so fiercely would not even cover the upcoming interest payments on the massive debt he was about to face. He had entirely forgotten about the mountain of financial obligations strictly tied to his name, blinded by his own arrogance. He was solely focused on the immediate gratification of leaving me with a completely empty bank account. He did not realize that while he was actively dreaming of total control, my elite wealth management team in Zurich was finalizing the encryption on a private portfolio worth $45 million. He thought he had easily outsmarted a dependent, uneducated housewife. Instead, he had just handed a highly specialized corporate strategist the exact legal and financial ammunition needed to completely dismantle his entire life. The joint account was empty, but his absolute ruin had just been guaranteed by his own actions. The morning sun pierced through the cabin windows as our flight began its descent into Zurich. The jagged snow-capped peaks of the Swiss Alps rose majestically in the distance, standing as a physical representation of the impenetrable fortress I had built for my son and myself. We landed smoothly, and within 20 minutes, a private concierge escorted us through an exclusive diplomatic customs line. There were no crowded baggage carousels or screaming travelers. A sleek, bulletproof Mercedes sedan was waiting on the tarmac. The driver greeted me in flawless German, loaded our pristine luggage, and whisked us away toward the city center. Leo pressed his small hands against the tinted glass, marveling at the pristine, glittering lake and the immaculate streets. He was safe, he was happy, and most importantly, he was entirely out of Brandon's toxic reach. Our new home was a stunning modern penthouse overlooking Lake Zurich. It was a corporate asset fully owned by my investment firm, meaning my name was nowhere on the lease or the public property registries. The apartment was equipped with biometric security and a private elevator. A highly recommended multilingual nanny was already waiting in the kitchen with a plate of fresh pastries and hot cocoa for Leo. As I watched my son instantly bond with his new caregiver, a profound sense of relief washed over me. I walked into the home office, a beautiful space enclosed by floor-to-ceiling glass, and opened my laptop. It was time to activate the legal shield I had spent the last 3 months carefully constructing. At exactly 9 a.m. local time, my private legal and financial team arrived at the penthouse. Leading the group was a brilliant international family law attorney named Felix, alongside my longtime Swiss wealth manager. We sat around the massive oak dining table drinking strong espresso while overlooking the serene Swiss waters. Felix handed me a thick binder containing the finalized documents of my legal defense. We went over the international jurisdiction protocols first. Because my firm had formally sponsored my permanent Swiss residency weeks ago, and because I had arrived with Brandon's notarized blanket travel consent form, I was completely immune to any Hague Convention claims. If Jamal tried to file parental kidnapping charges in Illinois, the international courts would immediately toss the case out. Brandon had legally authorized Leo's indefinite international travel. That single piece of paper acted as an impenetrable bulletproof vest against any extradition attempts. Next, we reviewed the financial architecture of my wealth. My $45 million was not sitting in a standard bank account waiting to be discovered by a subpoena. It was structured within a highly complex, irrevocable offshore trust. Under Swiss banking and corporate law, an irrevocable trust transfers the legal ownership of the assets from the individual to the trust itself. I was the primary beneficiary, but legally I owned absolutely nothing on paper. If a Chicago family court judge ordered me to split my assets, they would be demanding access to funds I technically did not own, housed in a jurisdiction that strictly refused to enforce United States Civil Asset Division judgments without a local Swiss court order. And Swiss courts notoriously favored the privacy and protection of established trusts. Jamal could scream file motions and threaten me with all the American legal jargon he wanted. He was bringing a plastic knife to a nuclear standoff. Felix presented the final piece of our strategy: the divorce petition. While Brandon and Jamal were likely sleeping off their hangovers, waiting until Monday morning to file their aggressive divorce papers in an Illinois county court, Felix had already filed my petition here in Switzerland the moment I landed. Under international law, the jurisdiction where the initial filing takes place often dictates how the proceedings unfold. By filing in Zurich as a legal resident, I forced Brandon to fight me on my turf. He would have to hire Swiss legal counsel, navigate a foreign legal system, and pay exorbitant international retainer fees just to show up to the preliminary hearings. A man who was currently guarding a miserable $18,000 in his checking account could never afford to cross the Atlantic to fight a corporate strategist with unlimited resources. I signed the final page of the Swiss divorce petition with a smooth stroke of my fountain pen. The trap was entirely set. I had legally isolated my son, completely shielded my massive fortune, and forced my arrogant husband into an international legal battle he lacked the funds and the intellect to survive. Felix collected the documents, his expression reflecting deep professional respect. He assured me the official divorce summons would be delivered to Brandon by a designated international process server within a few days. Until then, I was advised to maintain absolute radio silence. Let them panic. Let them wonder. Let them drain their limited resources trying to find a woman who had legally and effectively vanished from their hemisphere. After the legal team departed, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, breathing in the crisp, clean alpine air. For years, I had shrunk myself to fit into Brandon's small, insecure world. I had endured his mother's endless insults and his sister's petty jealousy, all while holding the power to buy and sell their entire lives 10 times over. I had hidden my success because society teaches successful women to coddle the egos of mediocre men. I realized then that my greatest mistake was not marrying Brandon, but hiding my own brilliance to keep him comfortable. That era of my life was officially dead. I took out my phone and checked my blocked messages folder, seeing dozens of frantic, threatening texts bouncing harmlessly against my digital blockade. I poured myself another espresso, feeling a deep, radiating warmth in my chest. The first phase of my plan was a flawless success. Now, all I had to do was wait for Monday morning, when the illusion of Brandon's grand victory would violently collide with the crushing reality of his massive hidden debt. That inevitable crash had been meticulously engineered over weeks of silent preparation, but the cornerstone of my entire escape relied on one specific evening. Looking back, securing the blanket travel consent was perhaps the most poetic justice of my entire plan. It weaponized Brandon's own massive ego and his profound weaponized incompetence directly against him. In our 7 years of marriage, Brandon had perfected the art of doing domestic tasks so poorly that I would eventually just take over everything. Laundry, grocery shopping, scheduling pediatric appointments. He constantly claimed his brain was far too taxed by his highly demanding mid-level management job. He convinced his mother, Brenda, that a man of his corporate stature should not be bothered with the trivial details of running a household. I let them both believe I agreed with that dynamic. I allowed Brandon to view me as the nagging detail-obsessed mother who handled the boring paperwork because she had absolutely nothing better to do with her time. I needed his signature to legally remove Leo from the United States. International kidnapping laws are incredibly strict, and without explicit notarized written consent from the other parent border control, would have flagged my passport instantly. Jamal would have had a legitimate legal avenue to drag me back to Chicago in handcuffs. I had to get Brandon to sign away his parental geographic rights without him ever reading the actual words on the page. I chose a Sunday evening in late October. The Chicago Bears were playing a crucial game against their division rivals. I knew Brandon would be a few beers deep, hyper-focused on the television, and extremely irritable regarding any interruptions. I spent the entire afternoon in my home office preparing the trap. I took a standard international blanket travel consent form and reformatted the entire document. I changed the font to match the exact typeface used by Leo's kindergarten administration. I adjusted the margins, added the school's colorful mascot logo to the top corner, and printed it on the exact same cheap, slightly textured copy paper the school used for their weekly newsletters. The document itself was a masterpiece of legal drafting. I had paid a private family lawyer in Geneva a premium consulting fee to draft the exact language required to satisfy both United States border security and Swiss immigration authorities. It included specific waivers of the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction. It contained clauses explicitly stating that Brandon relinquished his right to demand Leo's immediate return to the jurisdiction of Illinois. It was dense, aggressive, ironclad legal armor, and I had successfully disguised it beneath a cheerful cartoon picture of a yellow school bus. I then took 4 legitimate permission slips I had saved from Leo's folder: a Pizza Friday order form and allergy declaration, a volunteer sign-up sheet, and a genuine field trip permission slip for a local pumpkin patch. I slipped the heavily modified travel consent form right into the middle of the stack. I grabbed a heavy wooden clipboard and a black ink pen. I walked into the living room. The television was blaring. Brandon was slouched on the leather sofa, shouting at the screen, because the referee had just made a bad call. Empty beer bottles littered the coffee table. The air smelled of stale hops and unearned entitlement. "Brandon, I need you to sign these school forms for Leo," I said. I pitched my voice to sound tired and slightly nagging, perfectly playing the character he expected me to be. He did not even look away from the television. "Not now, Cassidy. It is the 4th quarter. They are due tomorrow morning," I insisted, stepping between him and the screen for just a fraction of a second. The teacher sent an email saying parents have to sign both the front and back pages for the upcoming activities. Just sign them quickly so I can put them in his backpack. Brandon let out a loud, exaggerated groan. He snatched the clipboard from my hands and grabbed the pen. "This is exactly why I work the long hours I do," he muttered, finally tearing his eyes away from the game to glare at the stack of papers. "So I do not have to deal with this endless, mind-numbing domestic paperwork. My brain deals with actual corporate contracts all week. I do not have the mental energy to read about pizza day and pumpkin patches." I stood perfectly still. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my face remained an absolute mask of bored suburban compliance. "Just sign at the highlighted tabs," I told him, pointing lazily at the yellow sticky notes I had attached to the signature lines. He flipped through the pages with aggressive, hurried movements. He signed the Pizza Friday form. He signed the allergy declaration. Then he flipped to the 3rd page, the blanket travel consent form. I held my breath. If he stopped to read even the first sentence, the entire plan would evaporate. If he saw the words international jurisdiction or indefinite travel, the illusion would shatter entirely. But Brandon did what Brandon always did. He assumed anything I handed him was trivial, boring, and beneath his supreme intellect. He barely glanced at the paper, scribbling his messy signature directly over the line that legally authorized me to take our son across any international border without notice or return date. He flipped to the next page and signed the pumpkin patch form, then shoved the clipboard aggressively back into my chest. "There, it is done." He snapped, his eyes already darting back to the football game. "Now let me watch my game in peace. Try handling this yourself next time. You literally have all day to figure this stuff out." "I will do that," I replied softly. "Thank you, Brandon." I turned and walked back to my home office. Once the door was closed, I leaned against the heavy wood and let out a shaky exhale. I looked down at the freshly inked signature. It was flawless. The arrogance of my husband had just handed me the master key to my freedom. The next morning, while Brandon was at his office pretending to be a corporate titan, I took the signed document to a discreet downtown notary. Because I had formatted the signature block carefully, I had left a specific section blank for the notary to witness my accompanying signature and apply their official raised seal. The notary stamped the paper, making it an undeniable, globally recognized legal instrument. Jamal, with his expensive law degree, would eventually demand to see the paperwork. He would analyze the flight manifests and contact Border Control, fully expecting to catch me in a blatant violation of international family law. I could perfectly envision the moment Jamal would pull the digital scan of the consent form from the customs database. He would put on his reading glasses, ready to find the loophole, only to realize that his own brother-in-law had legally authorized the entire escape. The realization that I had outmaneuvered a high-powered corporate attorney using nothing but a kindergarten clipboard would be an absolutely devastating blow to his massive ego. Now, sitting in the luxurious safety of my Zurich penthouse, I thought about that signed piece of paper tucked securely in my silver suitcase. Brandon's absolute refusal to participate in the basic duties of fatherhood had been the exact mechanism of his downfall. He had underestimated my intelligence every single day of our marriage, assuming my silence was a sign of submission rather than a sign of intense, calculated observation. He had signed away his family because he could not be bothered to miss a football play, and the financial devastation awaiting him was going to be magnificent. To understand the sheer scale of the disaster about to crash down on Brandon, one had to look at the exact mechanics of his infidelity. Brandon did not just blindly cheat on his wife. He deliberately and arrogantly orchestrated a massive financial liability, completely blinded by his own midlife crisis and an overwhelming desire to impress a 24-year-old marketing assistant named Amber. When we bought our suburban home 5 years ago, Brandon insisted on putting the deed and the primary mortgage entirely in his name. He claimed it was a matter of traditional pride, a way to prove to his mother Brenda and his brother-in-law Jamal that he was the absolute patriarch of our family. I had happily agreed, instantly meticulously maintaining my carefully constructed facade as the docile, compliant freelance consultant. I knew perfectly well that keeping my name off that specific asset meant I carried absolutely zero legal liability if the housing market crashed. I never expected that the crash would be entirely self-inflicted by my own husband. Amber was a recent university business graduate with incredibly expensive tastes and a glaringly obvious, unabashed desire for a quick, effortless shortcut to an ultra-luxury downtown lifestyle. Brandon, earning his modest project manager salary, was desperate to play the role of a high-rolling tech executive. He could not afford fancy hotel rooms or expensive gifts without raising red flags on our shared credit cards. His solution was an act of staggering financial recklessness. He walked into a bank and took out a $150,000 home equity line of credit against our suburban house. Because the property was exclusively in his name, he did not need my signature or my permission. He foolishly assumed he was an absolute financial genius, leveraging an asset I supposedly had no legal claim to whatsoever. He took that massive lump sum and used it as a massive down payment on a sleek, ultra-modern high-rise condo in the heart of downtown Chicago. When I found the paperwork shoved behind his filing cabinet 3 months ago, I did not just stop at reading the loan agreement. I launched a full corporate-level background investigation into the property itself. Using my professional resources, I pulled the public records on Amber's new luxury residence. Brandon had completely outdone himself in the worst way possible. He had co-signed the deed with Amber, meaning she legally owned half the asset, but he was entirely responsible for the massive monthly mortgage payments. More importantly, he had willingly tied himself to a building with astronomical homeowner association fees, luxury property taxes, and special assessment charges for a newly renovated rooftop pool. Brandon had locked himself into a monthly financial commitment that literally consumed 70% of his take-home pay. He was bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate, completely cannibalizing his own livelihood to maintain the illusion of wealth for a woman who only cared about the downtown zip code. For the past 3 months, while he thought he was pulling off the ultimate deception, he was actually drowning. I watched him quietly panic every time the mail arrived. I noticed him frantically moving small amounts of money between obscure checking accounts just to cover the minimum payments on the primary mortgage. He had completely tapped out his credit lines trying to furnish Amber's condo with imported Italian leather sofas and high-end electronics. He was living paycheck to paycheck, sweating through his cheap suits, terrified that the financial house of cards was about to collapse. And the most beautiful part of this entire disaster was that I had been the one quietly keeping that house of cards standing. Every month for the last 5 years, I had discreetly transferred $3,000 into his primary checking account under the guise of contributing my modest freelance earnings to the household budget. That specific transfer was the only thing keeping the original suburban mortgage from going into immediate default. When I discovered this secret condo, I did not confront him. I simply logged into my banking portal and permanently canceled that recurring monthly transfer. I knew exactly what would happen. Brandon was so incredibly disorganized and overwhelmed by funding his double life that he never even noticed my deposits had stopped. He just assumed his money was incredibly tight because of Amber's expensive demands. As a result, the primary mortgage on the suburban house went completely unpaid for 90 consecutive days. The bank had already issued multiple late warnings, all of which Brandon had likely intercepted and hidden in his messy office, assuming he could eventually borrow against his retirement or beg his mother Brenda for a temporary bailout. He genuinely believed he could juggle the massive downtown condo payments, the suburban mortgage, and his extravagant lifestyle without the entire system imploding. He thought his biggest problem was navigating a messy separation from a dependent wife. He thought grabbing that $18,000 from our joint account made him invincible. He had absolutely no idea that a formal notice of default had already been generated by his primary lender. The major commercial bank was legally preparing to aggressively seize the entire suburban house. By fleeing to Switzerland and completely abandoning the property, I was stepping off the tracks right before the freight train hit. Brandon had secured the luxury condo for his mistress by gambling his actual home, and now he was about to lose both. When Monday morning arrived, the bank would freeze his compromised accounts. Amber would realize her sugar daddy was actually broke, and Jamal's arrogant legal threats would be utterly useless against a massive corporate banking foreclosure. I closed my eyes as my private plane flew smoothly over the dark, sprawling ocean, deeply savoring the absolute certainty of his impending irreversible destruction. Monday morning arrived in Zurich with a crisp, brilliant clarity. The sunlight bounced off the pristine surface of Lake Zurich, flooding my glass-enclosed home office with a radiant, empowering glow. I had spent the entire weekend comfortably settling Leo into his new, luxurious routine. He was currently in the adjoining playroom, happily building a massive wooden block tower with his new multilingual nanny, completely shielded from the toxic chaos unfolding across the Atlantic Ocean. I sat at my sleek mahogany desk, wearing a tailored charcoal blazer, and finally took my smartphone off airplane mode. The device immediately vibrated violently against the hardwood surface. Dozens of notifications rapidly flooded the high-definition screen. There were countless missed calls, angry text messages, and an onslaught of highly aggressive emails. One specific email instantly caught my eye. It was from Jamal, sent directly from his prestigious corporate law firm email address. The subject line read in bold capital letters, "Urgent legal summons regarding child abduction and marital abandonment." The body of the email contained a strict, arrogant ultimatum, demanding my immediate presence on a secure Zoom video call at exactly 9 a.m. Chicago time. Jamal explicitly stated that a failure to attend would result in him filing an emergency ex parte motion with a local family court judge to strip my parental rights entirely. I checked the gold clock on my desk. It was exactly 4 in the afternoon in Zurich, which aligned perfectly with Jamal's dictated deadline. I clicked the provided digital link and launched the application. The screen split into two separate high-resolution video feeds. In one frame sat my soon-to-be ex-husband. Brandon was positioned at the kitchen island of the suburban house he was about to tragically lose, wearing a smug, overconfident grin. He had a mug of coffee in his hand and looked entirely too pleased with himself. In the second frame sat Jamal. My brother-in-law was broadcasting from his high-rise downtown office, wearing a bespoke navy suit, leaning forward with his hands steepled under his chin. He looked like an apex predator, ready to deliver the final killing blow. Cassidy Jamal began his deep baritone voice, carrying a tone of absolute manufactured authority. I am recording this session for official legal purposes. Let the record clearly show that you have abandoned the marital property and unlawfully removed a minor child from the jurisdiction of Illinois. You have severely miscalculated your position. I am giving you exactly 24 hours to put Leo on a commercial flight back to Chicago. If you comply, Brandon is willing to negotiate a heavily supervised visitation schedule. If you refuse, I will personally contact federal authorities and initiate a Hague Convention protocol for international child abduction. You will be arrested the moment you land on American soil. Brandon leaned closer to his camera, his grin widening into a sneer. You really thought you could just run away, he mocked. You have zero income, zero credit, and you are hiding out in a foreign country. You are completely pathetic. Return my son, surrender whatever pitiful savings you managed to scrape together, and I might agree not to sue you for full alimony. You walked out on me, so you owe me big time. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, allowing a slow, icy smile to spread across my face. I took a deliberate sip of my espresso, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them both slightly uncomfortable. Are you quite finished, Jamal? I asked, my tone utterly devoid of fear or intimidation. Because as a highly educated corporate lawyer, your grasp on international family law is embarrassingly inadequate. Jamal scoffed, shaking his head with mock pity. Do not play games with me, Cassidy. You are an unemployed consultant. You do not understand the massive legal avalanche that is about to crush you. I have already drafted the emergency custody orders. Brandon is the sole owner of the primary residence. He has stable employment, and you have committed a federal felony. You have absolutely no leverage. I reached across my desk and picked up a crisp white document. I held it up directly to the high-definition camera lens. I think you should read this very carefully, counselor, I said, keeping my voice dangerously soft. I will read the bold print for you. It is a fully notarized blanket travel consent form. It explicitly grants me unilateral indefinite permission to transport Leo across any international borders. It includes a specific binding waiver of the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction. Jamal frowned, leaning closer to his computer monitor. His eyes darted rapidly as he tried to read the text through the screen. What is that? That is a blatant forgery. Brandon never signed any international waivers. I pulled the document closer to the camera. I am sure you recognize your own client's signature right here at the bottom, I replied smoothly. He signed it exactly 1 month ago. It was conveniently stapled between a pizza day authorization and a kindergarten pumpkin patch permission slip. He was too busy watching a football game to read what he was signing. So to address your first hollow threat, there has been no kidnapping. Border Control gladly waved me through. Your federal abduction claims are completely dead on arrival. The smugness vanished from Jamal's face in an absolute instant. The rich color drained from his cheeks as his sharp legal mind rapidly processed the catastrophic implication of what I had just shown him. He slowly turned his head to look directly at Brandon's video feed. Brandon, he demanded, his voice dropping a full octave. Did you sign a travel consent form without reading it? Brandon blinked, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift in Jamal's confident demeanor. I do not know. She handed me a bunch of school papers. Who reads that garbage? I just signed where she put the yellow sticky notes. It does not matter. She tricked me. A judge will throw it out immediately. Jamal closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose in sheer frustration. "You absolute idiot," he muttered under his breath, completely dropping his professional facade. "It is a notarized legal document, Brandon. You literally handed her a golden ticket out of the country." Before Brandon could formulate a defensive response, I dropped the second bomb. Furthermore, I continued, my voice slicing through their rising panic. "You cannot file for divorce or custody in Illinois because you have already been beaten to the punch. I am a legally sponsored permanent resident of Switzerland. My elite legal team officially filed the divorce petition in the canton of Zurich at exactly 8 in the morning Central European Time today. Under international jurisdictional protocols, this divorce will be litigated exclusively here. If you wish to contest custody or demand your ridiculous alimony, you will need to retain Swiss legal counsel, fly to Zurich, and fight me in a European court." Brandon's face turned a mottled, furious shade of red. "You cannot do that. You do not have the money to hire Swiss lawyers. You are completely bluffing." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany desk. "I am not bluffing, Brandon. You thought you were so incredibly clever, transferring that measly $18,000 out of our joint account? You thought you were stripping my power, but you failed to realize that I let you take those pennies because I was busy protecting millions. You are currently fighting a war you lost before you even knew it started." Jamal stared at the screen, his previous arrogance entirely replaced by a creeping, profound sense of dread. He was a highly trained corporate lawyer, and he was finally beginning to realize that the woman sitting across the digital divide was not a frightened, dependent housewife. She was an absolute apex predator who had just locked them both inside a meticulously constructed, inescapable legal cage. The silence on the Zoom call stretched into a suffocating vacuum. Jamal stared at his monitor, his perfectly manicured hands now gripping the edge of his mahogany desk. He was accustomed to bullying intimidated spouses into submission, leveraging his corporate credentials to force rapid, unfavorable settlements. He had never faced an opponent who utilized European federal statutes as a first line of defense. "You cannot establish legal residency in Switzerland overnight, Cassidy," Jamal finally said, attempting to inject a tone of bored skepticism back into his voice. "The Swiss Civil Code requires actual domicile intent. A weekend vacation does not grant you jurisdiction. The courts in Illinois will easily compel a return of jurisdiction." I smiled, genuinely amused by his textbook response. "You would be absolutely right, Jamal, if this were a weekend vacation. However, my corporate sponsor officially initiated my permanent residency permits months ago. I hold a valid long-term employment contract with a Zurich-based firm. My residential lease is a long-term corporate asset. I pay Swiss cantonal taxes. The local magistrate formally accepted my divorce petition this morning because I meet every single statutory requirement for international filing. You are entirely out of your depth." Brandon scoffed loudly, waving his hand at the camera. "You do not have a corporate sponsor. You do freelance consulting for small local businesses. You literally make pennies. Stop lying to my lawyer." I ignored Brandon completely and kept my eyes fixed on Jamal. "Jamal, explain to your client what happens when a divorce involves highly complex, internationally housed trusts and a foreign petitioner. Tell him about the retainer fees." Jamal swallowed hard. His eyes darted away from the camera. "Brandon, if she has actually established a valid international jurisdiction, we will have to retain local Swiss counsel to challenge the filing. We cannot represent you directly in Zurich. American law licenses hold no weight in their cantonal courts. So hire a Swiss guy." Brandon barked, his face turning a blotchy red. "We have the house. We have assets. We will crush her." To retain a high-tier international family law firm in Zurich, you are looking at a minimum initial retainer of $50,000, Jamal explained, his voice losing all its previous bravado. "And that is just to file the preliminary jurisdictional challenges. If this goes to a full international custody and asset battle, you could easily spend $250,000 before we even see the inside of a courtroom." Brandon froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. $50,000 just to start. He stammered, looking wildly between the camera and his brother-in-law. "I do not have $50,000 laying around in cash." What about the 18,000 you transferred from our joint account last night? I asked, feigning innocent curiosity. Surely that will cover a few hours of billable time for a top Swiss litigator. Perhaps you can ask your mother to mortgage her house to fund your legal defense. Shut your mouth, Brandon shouted, slamming his fist against his kitchen island. You are bluffing. You do not have the money to fight this either. You are trying to scare me into walking away. I am offering you an out, I stated, dropping the pleasantries. My tone turned sharp and absolute. My lawyers will send you a highly simplified settlement agreement by tomorrow morning. The terms are non-negotiable. You will grant me sole physical and legal custody of Leo. You will waive all rights to seek alimony or spousal support. You will completely forfeit any and all claims to my business assets, my corporate income, or my offshore trusts. In exchange, I will grant you full, uncontested ownership of the suburban house, and I will not seek child support. Brandon threw his head back and laughed a harsh, desperate sound. You want me to just hand over my son and walk away with nothing but the house? You must be out of your mind. I am not signing anything. I am going to drag you back to Chicago, and I am going to take half of whatever secret money you think you are hiding. You have no idea what you are actually holding, do you? I asked, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. You think you won the suburban house. You think you secured your financial future because your name is the only one on the deed. But you forgot one massive, fatal detail, Brandon. I am a mergers and acquisitions strategist. My entire career revolves around identifying toxic debt and liquidating bad assets. You did not win a house, you won a financial anchor. The house is worth $500,000, Brandon yelled, pointing a finger at the webcam. I have almost 200,000 in equity. I won. You had 200,000 in equity, I corrected him. Before you secretly took out a $150,000 home equity line of credit 3 months ago. Before you used our family home as leverage to buy a downtown luxury condo with your 24-year-old mistress Amber. The silence that fell over the Zoom call was absolute. Jamal's eyes widened in genuine shock. He whipped his head toward Brandon's video feed. Brandon, what is she talking about? You took out a second mortgage. You bought real estate with another woman. Brandon's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. He looked completely paralyzed, completely incapable of formulating a lie fast enough to cover his tracks. Oh, did he not tell you, Jamal? I asked sweetly. Your brilliant client leveraged his primary residence to the absolute maximum limit. And here is the truly fascinating part about Illinois marital law. Because he explicitly took out that loan solely in his name, and specifically utilized the funds to purchase an asset with an entirely unrelated third party outside the marriage, I bear zero legal responsibility for that debt. He committed financial infidelity. I am completely insulated. Jamal ran a hand over his face, realizing the catastrophic mess his brother-in-law had created. Brandon, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not leverage the marital home for a mistress. Brandon could barely speak. It is an investment property, he mumbled weakly, refusing to make eye contact with his own lawyer. Amber just co-signed. It is an investment. It is a financial death sentence, I corrected. You owe massive monthly payments on that downtown condo. You owe the primary mortgage on the suburban house. You have maxed out your personal credit cards furnishing Amber's apartment. And the $3,000 I quietly deposited into your checking account every single month to keep you afloat has permanently stopped. I leaned closer to the camera, letting my eyes lock onto his terrified face. I did not just leave you, Brandon. I stepped out of the way right before the bank destroys you. You have a choice. Sign the uncontested divorce papers and desperately try to salvage your sinking ship, or fight me in a Swiss court and watch me completely vaporize what little remains of your miserable life. Before either of them could formulate a response, I reached forward and abruptly ended the call. The high-definition screen went completely black, severing their connection to me permanently. The meticulously designed trap was officially sprung. The pathetic illusion of his victory was rapidly dissolving, and the brutal, inescapable reality of his massive financial ruin was about to hit him with the full force of a runaway freight train. While I was comfortably sipping a fresh espresso in my Swiss penthouse, Brandon was desperately trying to glue the shattered pieces of his fragile ego back together. Absolute panic had briefly seized his chest. Jamal started pacing the office angrily, lecturing Brandon about the severe legal malpractice of hiding a second mortgage and challenging a corporate strategist. Jamal demanded that Brandon liquidate whatever assets he could and beg for a settlement. But men like Brandon do not understand strategic retreats. They only understand doubling down on their own delusions. Instead of heeding his lawyer's advice, Brandon kicked Jamal out, called him a coward, and decided the best way to handle an impending financial apocalypse was to throw a massive party. By Friday evening, the suburban house I had meticulously designed was filled with the loud, obnoxious sounds of unearned celebration. Brandon needed an audience to validate his hollow victory. He had officially invited his mother, Brenda, his sister, Samantha, and several of his superficial tech firm colleagues to celebrate his newfound status as a free man. More importantly, he used the occasion to publicly debut Amber. He paraded the 24-year-old marketing assistant around the living room, presenting her not as a homewrecker, but as his brilliant new start. Amber wore a cocktail dress that was entirely too expensive for her salary, clutching champagne and clinging to Brandon's arm. She was completely intoxicated by the illusion of his wealth, wholly unaware that the man she was clinging to was financially bleeding to death. Brenda, who had spent the last 7 years finding every possible flaw in my existence, immediately fawned over Amber. She praised the girl's youth and outfit. Brenda loudly proclaimed that Brandon had finally found a woman who respected him, a woman who understood traditional family values and knew how to treat a successful provider. Samantha chimed in, offering endless toasts to Brandon for securing the massive suburban house and successfully kicking his dead-weight wife to the curb. They stood in the kitchen. I paid for drinking wine from my glasses, congratulating themselves on a victory that was mathematically impossible. Brandon played the role of the generous host to absolute perfection, but the performance was incredibly expensive. Desperate to prove that my departure had not affected his lifestyle in the slightest, he had hired a premium catering service to provide hors d'oeuvres and an open bar. When the catering manager had requested the initial deposit earlier that week, Brandon proudly swiped his debit card, drawing directly from the $18,000 he had siphoned from our joint account. He completely ignored the terrifying fact that his massive primary mortgage was severely past due, that the utility bills were piling up on the entryway console, and that his car payment was scheduled to hit on Monday. He was running purely on adrenaline and sheer denial. As the evening wore on, the alcohol flowed freely, and the cracks in Brandon's arrogant facade slowly began to show. He was sweating through his expensive dress shirt, his eyes constantly darting toward his phone. Every notification made him flinch. He was terrified it was another communication from his bank or a legal summons from my international legal team. He drank heavily to numb the creeping, suffocating anxiety, laughing a little too loudly at his colleagues' jokes and bragging incessantly about his upcoming promotion at work. Amber pulled him aside near the hallway, her perfectly glossed lips pouting slightly. She kept her voice low, but the panic in her tone was unmistakable. "Brandon, the property management company for the condo, sent another email today," she whispered, holding on to his lapel. "They said the $5,000 special assessment fee for the rooftop pool renovation is due by Tuesday. You promised you would wire the funds to my account yesterday. They are threatening to apply late penalties." Brandon swallowed hard, a cold bead of sweat rolling down the back of his neck. He forced a wide, reassuring smile and patted her hand. "Do not worry about it, babe. It is just a minor banking delay because of the divorce paperwork. My accounts are going through a standard security review since I kicked Cassidy out. I will march into the bank first thing Monday morning and force them to push the wire transfer through. I have it completely under control." Amber smiled, easily placated by the confident lie, and kissed his cheek before returning to the party to soak up more of Brenda's lavish attention. Brandon leaned against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. $5,000. If he paid the condo assessment, he would have less than $10,000 left to his name. The luxury downtown apartment was a parasitic drain on his resources, and Amber expected a lifestyle that required a minimum of $20,000 a month to maintain. He took a long, desperate pull from his whiskey glass, telling himself that his yearly bonus was only 3 months away, and he just needed to survive until then. His fragile delusion was violently interrupted when the catering manager approached him with a sleek digital payment tablet. "Excuse me, sir," the manager said politely. "We are preparing to pack up the service for the evening. I just need to run the card on file for the remaining balance of $2,400. Brandon nodded magnanimously, pulling his debit card from his wallet with a theatrical flourish for the benefit of his nearby coworkers. "Run it. Add a 20% tip for your staff. You guys did an outstanding job tonight." The manager tapped the screen, inserted the card, and waited. A sharp, negative beep emitted from the device. The manager frowned and tried again. Another harsh beep. "I apologize, sir," the manager said, his polite tone faltering slightly. "The card is declining. It says insufficient funds." The conversation in the immediate vicinity stopped dead. Samantha paused mid-sip of her wine. Brandon's coworkers exchanged awkward, silent glances. The color completely vanished from Brandon's face. He snatched the card from the manager, his hands trembling. "That is impossible. Try it again. Your machine must be broken. I have plenty of money in that account." The manager ran the chip a third time, turning the screen so Brandon could see the glaring red text for himself. The digital screen flashed the exact same brutal, unforgiving message. Insufficient funds. The bank had not just simply declined the catering transaction. They had placed a hard, absolute freeze on his entire private checking account due to the consecutive missed payments on his massive primary mortgage. The financial reckoning he had been desperately trying to ignore had officially breached the walls of his celebration. He stood utterly paralyzed in the center of his own living room, holding a useless piece of plastic, as the undeniable reality of his complete financial ruin finally began to take hold. Brandon stared at the tiny digital screen of the payment tablet, his mind desperately scrambling for a plausible excuse. He forced a strained, unnatural laugh, waving his empty hand dismissively at the catering manager. "The banking app must be undergoing scheduled maintenance," he lied, his voice pitching higher than normal. "Corporate security protocols often flag large weekend transactions." He looked frantically toward his mother. Brenda, desperate to preserve her son's manufactured image in front of his colleagues, swiftly opened her designer purse. She produced her own platinum credit card, loudly declaring that she wanted to treat everyone to celebrate Brandon's fresh start. The manager processed her payment, handed back the receipt, and hastily directed his staff to exit the premises. The damage to the atmosphere was already done. The music playing from the surround sound speakers suddenly felt hollow. Brandon's coworkers politely finished their drinks, offered stilted apologies about early morning golf tee times, and practically sprinted for the front door. Samantha and Jamal retreated to the kitchen, their previous celebratory mood entirely extinguished. Amber stood near the hallway, her arms crossed tightly over her expensive cocktail dress. Her eyes narrowed with genuine suspicion. She was young, but she was not completely foolish. She recognized the distinct smell of financial instability, and it made her physically recoil from the man she had just been clinging to. Brandon spent the remainder of the night aggressively pouring himself drinks, insisting to his remaining family members that the banking issue was just a minor administrative error caused by my international divorce filing. The brutal reality check arrived the very next morning. It was a bleak, overcast Saturday. Brandon woke up with a pounding hangover, dragging himself down the stairs of the massive suburban house. Brenda, Samantha, and Jamal had stayed overnight in the guest rooms, refusing to leave Brandon alone in his agitated state. Amber had quietly ordered her own rideshare back to the downtown condo before midnight, claiming she had a sudden migraine. The heavy wooden front door shuddered under a series of loud, aggressive knocks. Brandon groaned, clutching his throbbing temples, and pulled the door open. A burly man in a windbreaker stood on the porch, holding a thick, legally sealed envelope. "Are you Brandon?" the man asked, his tone strictly professional and devoid of any warmth. Brandon nodded slowly, squinting against the harsh morning daylight. "Yes, that is me. What do you want?" The man shoved the heavy envelope directly into Brandon's chest. "You have been served." The man turned on his heel and walked rapidly down the driveway, climbing into a parked sedan and speeding away. Brandon stood in the foyer staring at the thick packet in his hands. The return address, printed in bold black ink, belonged to the largest commercial real estate lender in the state of Illinois. Jamal, holding a cup of black coffee, stepped out of the kitchen. His sharp legal instincts immediately recognized the distinct packaging of a catastrophic legal summons. Jamal snatched the envelope from Brandon's shaking hands, ripped open the seal, and pulled out a massive stack of formal legal documents. Jamal's eyes scanned the first page. The color completely drained from his face for the second time in 24 hours. He looked up at Brandon, absolute horror radiating from his dark brown eyes. "Brandon, what exactly did you do?" Jamal demanded, his deep voice shaking with barely contained fury. "It is just a late notice," Brandon stammered, backing away slightly. "I missed a couple of payments because Cassidy stopped contributing her share. I will call them on Monday and set up a payment plan. It is fine." "This is not a late notice, you arrogant fool!" Jamal shouted, slamming the papers onto the entryway console. "This is a formal notice of default and an aggressive foreclosure summons. The bank is legally seizing this house. You are entirely in default on the primary mortgage, and they have accelerated the entire remaining balance because you secretly took out a massive second mortgage without their required authorization. You violated the primary loan covenants. They are demanding the entire $500,000 immediately." Brenda and Samantha rushed into the hallway, drawn by Jamal's explosive shouting. Brenda grabbed her son's arm, her eyes wide with mounting panic. "Brandon, tell me he is reading this wrong. Tell me you did not lose the house." "He lost the house, Brenda," Jamal snapped furiously, flipping through the attached exhibits. "And he lost his mind. Look at these exhibits. The bank ran a full asset check. They know about the downtown condo he bought with his mistress. They know his private checking accounts are completely drained. They are filing an emergency motion to seize this property and auction it off in 45 days to recoup their losses. And because Cassidy legally removed her name from the deed and the mortgage years ago, she is completely protected from this nuclear fallout. She left you holding the bag right before it exploded." Brandon collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, burying his face in his hands. His entire body shook. He had leveraged his entire existence to maintain the illusion of being a powerful, wealthy patriarch. He had driven his wife away, stolen from their joint accounts, and lied to his family. Now the absolute certainty of his ruin was printed on 50 pages of undeniable legal text. "You need to call Cassidy right now!" Brenda shrieked, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place as she frantically grabbed Brandon's shoulder. "You need to beg her to fix this. Tell her you will fire the mistress. Tell her she can come home. She has to have money hidden somewhere. She has to save this family." Jamal let out a loud, bitter laugh that echoed harshly in the spacious foyer. "She is not saving anybody, Brenda. She is sitting in a penthouse in Switzerland with an ironclad offshore trust and an impenetrable legal defense. She outsmarted all of us." Jamal tossed the foreclosure summons onto the floor like it was physically burning his hands. He pulled out his smartphone and opened a calculator app, his fingers jabbing the bright screen with aggressive, furious strikes. "Let us do the actual math," Brandon Jamal said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Because clearly basic numbers are not your strong suit. You owe $500,000 on this primary mortgage. You secretly took out a $150,000 second mortgage for a young girl you barely know. That is $650,000 of immediate, highly toxic debt completely and solely in your name." Brandon kept his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with genuine panic. "I can fix it," he mumbled weakly. "I will take a hardship loan from my corporate retirement account. I will call the bank first thing Monday morning and sort this out." Jamal laughed again, a harsh barking sound. "You cannot borrow against a retirement account when your financial assets are actively frozen by a commercial lender, you absolute moron. They have initiated a hard systemic freeze across all your associated accounts. That $18,000 you proudly transferred last night is currently locked behind a severe banking hold. You do not have access to a single cent. You cannot pay the downtown condo fees. You cannot pay your luxury car lease. You cannot even buy your own groceries right now. Brenda sank onto the bottom stair next to her son. She stared blankly at the scattered legal documents, her hands trembling violently as the grand illusion of her wealthy, successful boy completely evaporated. But the equity, she pleaded, looking desperately up at Jamal. He has equity in the property. We can sell it quickly on the open market and pay the bank back. There is absolutely no equity left. Brenda Jamal snapped, completely dropping any remaining shred of respect for his mother-in-law. He aggressively cannibalized all of it for the downtown apartment. The bank will quickly auction this house for a fraction of its retail value just to recoup their primary loan. They will then hit Brandon with a massive deficiency judgment for the remaining balance. They will aggressively garnish his corporate wages. They will legally seize his car. They will absolutely bankrupt him before the end of the year. Samantha, who had been standing silently near the kitchen doorway, crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She glared down at her older brother with pure, unfiltered disgust. You threw away a woman who was secretly paying your bills just so you could play sugar daddy to a junior assistant. You deliberately dragged us into this pathetic mess. You made us drink champagne and celebrate your supreme stupidity last night. I did not know she was paying the bills, Brandon yelled, finally looking up, his eyes red and frantic. She hid her wealth. She lied to me for years. She survived you, Jamal corrected coldly. And now you are a massive financial liability to this entire family. I am officially dropping you as a client. I cannot associate my prestigious corporate firm with a man facing an aggressive banking seizure. Jamal turned on his heel, grabbed his expensive wool coat from the hall closet, and walked out the front door without looking back. Samantha immediately followed her husband, abandoning her brother. Brandon and Brenda were left sitting entirely alone in the echoing cold foyer of a giant house they had already lost. The heavy silence in the foyer was broken only by the sound of rain violently lashing against the massive decorative windows. Brandon stared blankly at the foreclosure notice scattered across the imported tile floor. His mother, Brenda, slowly stood up, brushing off her expensive skirt with trembling, manicured hands. She looked around the expansive living room, suddenly realizing that every single item of value, the custom drapery, the high-end appliances, the custom light fixtures, was about to become the property of a commercial bank. "Get up, Brandon," Brenda commanded, her voice thin and brittle. "You cannot sit here crying like a child. We need to pack your things immediately before the bank sends a regional property manager to physically change the locks. You are coming home with me." Brandon dragged himself up from the bottom step, moving with the sluggish, heavy steps of an utterly defeated man. He walked up the sweeping staircase to the master bedroom, pulling open his closet doors. He aggressively grabbed armfuls of his off-the-rack corporate suits and threw them onto the bare mattress. Because I had systematically packed my belongings in our premium hard-shell luggage, Brandon was forced to shove his entire wardrobe into heavy-duty black plastic trash bags he found under the kitchen sink. The sheer indignity of dragging trash bags filled with cheap neckties and wrinkled dress shirts down the pristine staircase was a brutal, physical manifestation of his massive failure. "We need to stop at the downtown condo first," Brandon insisted as he threw the final trash bag into the trunk of Brenda's sedan. "I need to talk to Amber. I need to explain the banking freeze. If I can just get inside the condo, I have some emergency cash stashed in a desk drawer. We can lay low there until I sort this out with the corporate lenders on Monday." Brenda gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. She hated the idea of her son crawling to a 24-year-old mistress, but she was desperate for any solution that did not involve Brandon moving back into her immaculate guest room. She drove through the pouring rain toward the downtown financial district, pulling up to the sleek, glass-enclosed high-rise building where Brandon had secretly sunk his entire financial future. Brandon jogged through the automatic sliding doors, his expensive leather shoes squeaking awkwardly on the polished marble lobby floor. He bypassed the front desk and swiped his electronic key fob at the private resident elevator. The scanner flashed a harsh, solid red light. Access denied. Brandon frowned aggressively, swiping the plastic fob 3 more times. Red light, red light, red light. "Excuse me, sir," the building concierge called out, stepping out from behind the mahogany front desk. The concierge, a tall, imposing man with an earpiece, crossed his arms firmly. The property management company has permanently deactivated your building access credentials. What are you talking about? Brandon demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet lobby. I am a legal co-owner of Unit 412. I pay the massive monthly mortgage on that property. You cannot legally lock me out of my own investment. The concierge pulled a digital tablet from his jacket. The primary resident of Unit 412, a Miss Amber Davis, formally requested your immediate removal from the approved guest and resident registry exactly 2 hours ago. Furthermore, the banking institution responsible for the property's special assessment fees contacted our management office this morning. The electronic wire transfer you promised bounced entirely due to a hard account freeze. The condo association is officially placing a legal lien on the unit by Tuesday. Miss Davis left a message for you if you attempted to bypass security. Read it, Brandon demanded, his face flushing a deep, humiliated crimson. The concierge cleared his throat, reading directly from the glowing screen. Tell Brandon that his debit card for the luxury furniture delivery declined this morning. I am not ruining my pristine credit score for a man who lied about his wealth and cannot even afford a basic rooftop assessment fee. I am changing the internal locks. Have your lawyers call my lawyers. We are completely done. Brandon stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. The young, naive girl he thought he had completely manipulated with his false wealth had just ruthlessly severed their connection the exact second the money stopped flowing. Amber was not a starry-eyed romantic. She was a brutal opportunist, and she had immediately recognized a sinking ship. She was currently barricaded inside the luxury apartment his massive debt had financed, and he had absolutely no legal way to cross the threshold without initiating a highly public, embarrassing police intervention. He walked back out into the freezing rain and climbed heavily into the passenger seat of his mother's car. Brenda took one look at his devastated, pale face and immediately put the vehicle into drive. She did not ask questions. She simply drove them straight to her modest, aging house in the suburbs. Moving back into his childhood bedroom was the ultimate crushing degradation. The room still had the same faded wallpaper and the narrow twin bed from his high school days. Brandon dropped his black plastic trash bags onto the thin carpet. He sat on the edge of the squeaky mattress, staring blankly at the wall. In less than 48 hours, he had lost a supportive wife, a $500,000 suburban home, a luxury downtown condo, an attractive young mistress, and every single dollar of his liquid cash. Brenda stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly. She was already mentally calculating the intense social embarrassment of hiding her bankrupt son from her judgmental bridge club friends. You are going to fix this, Brandon, she commanded sharply. You are going to wake up on Monday, march into your office and secure that massive promotion you have been bragging about for 6 months. Brandon looked up, a sudden, desperate spark of hope igniting in his tired eyes. The promotion. He was currently the leading internal candidate for a senior regional director position at his tech firm. The new role came with an enormous base salary increase, robust executive stock options, and a massive signing bonus. You are absolutely right, Mom, Brandon said, his voice gaining a frantic, manic energy. I am still a highly respected corporate manager. The regional director promotion is virtually guaranteed to be mine. Once I secure that executive contract on Monday, the signing bonus will easily cover the late mortgage penalties. I will clear the bank freeze, hire the most ruthless and expensive divorce attorney in Chicago, and absolutely destroy Cassidy in court. I will make her pay for this. He grabbed his phone aggressively, drafting a perfectly polished email to his department head, confirming his readiness for the final executive interview scheduled for Monday morning. He convinced himself that his corporate career was his impenetrable armor. He genuinely believed his job was the one secure, untouchable fortress that my strategic warfare could not possibly reach. He went to sleep on his tiny twin bed, dreaming of a massive corporate paycheck that would miraculously erase his catastrophic debt. He had absolutely no idea that while he was desperately clinging to the promise of a corporate promotion, my elite Swiss acquisition team was aggressively finalizing the ultimate corporate buyout. He thought his job was his sanctuary, entirely unaware that I had just successfully purchased the very ground he was standing on. The sprawling glass and steel headquarters of my Swiss investment firm hummed with the quiet, efficient energy of extreme wealth. I sat at the head of a massive slate conference table, surrounded by a team of elite financial analysts and senior European partners. Projected on the high-definition digital display board behind me was the complete organizational structure of Brandon's employer, a mid-tier American software company that had been desperately seeking a massive capital bailout for the past 8 months. I had originally identified the company's severely undervalued tech assets long before Brandon's blatant infidelity had come to light. It was initially a purely objective business target. However, when I initiated my exit strategy from our toxic marriage, I aggressively accelerated the entire acquisition timeline. My firm had quietly and ruthlessly purchased a controlling majority stake through a complex network of anonymous subsidiary holdings. We now possessed absolute executive authority over their entire corporate board, including final approval on all structural reorganizations, departmental budgets, and executive promotions. The sheer irony of this situation deepened beautifully when I reviewed the external legal counsel retained by the American firm to handle the complex regulatory compliance of the international buyout. They had hired a prestigious Chicago-based corporate law firm to finalize the domestic paperwork and negotiate the transition terms. The lead attorney assigned to represent the American sellers was none other than Jamal. My arrogant, condescending brother-in-law had spent his entire weekend aggressively ignoring Brandon's catastrophic foreclosure crisis because he was obsessively preparing for this exact corporate merger. Jamal was desperately banking on this high-profile international deal closing flawlessly to secure his highly coveted promotion to senior partner. He was dreaming of massive billable hours, immense corporate prestige, and a corner office with his name on the door. He had spent his entire morning berating his junior associates, demanding absolute perfection for the upcoming merger call. He had even muted the family group chat, completely dismissing Brenda's frantic updates about Brandon's financial collapse, because his own career trajectory always took absolute precedence. He had absolutely no idea that the anonymous European holding company he was fiercely trying to impress was currently being spearheaded by the very sister-in-law he had threatened to destroy just 48 hours prior. Back in Chicago, Monday morning arrived with a brutal, contrasting reality. Brandon woke up in his cramped childhood twin bed, suppressing a massive wave of mounting anxiety. He put on his most expensive, freshly pressed suit and drove his least luxury sedan toward the downtown corporate office. He walked through the sleek glass revolving doors with a completely unearned, exaggerated swagger. He greeted his passing colleagues with loud, boisterous enthusiasm, desperately acting as if the humiliating catering disaster from his weekend party had never happened. He was running on pure adrenaline and the pathetic hope that if he just secured a large enough salary increase, Amber would magically return to the luxury condo and his mother would stop looking at him with thinly veiled disgust. He grabbed a premium coffee from the break room and took a seat in the executive waiting area, confidently reviewing his heavily rehearsed talking points about leadership, regional expansion, and dynamic financial growth. He was entirely blind to the nervous, frantic energy radiating through the executive suite as credible rumors of an imminent foreign hostile buyout rapidly circulated among the senior partners. He genuinely believed he was about to walk into an interview that would hand him a massive signing bonus and solve all of his crushing debt in one swift motion. Thousands of miles away, I opened the digital personnel file that the American Human Resources Department had just transmitted to my secure server. I scanned the list of recommended internal promotions submitted by their outgoing management team. I easily located Brandon's name near the very top of the roster. He was officially listed as the primary candidate for the senior regional director position. I picked up a heavy gold-plated pen and tapped it thoughtfully against my mahogany desk. The strict restructuring protocol our Swiss firm mandated for all new acquisitions dictated that redundant mid-level management positions must be immediately liquidated to maximize operational efficiency. I had personally reviewed the specific clauses of the acquisition agreement to ensure we bypassed any protective severance packages for middle management. Brandon was not getting a highly lucrative executive promotion. He was about to receive a standard basic termination notice that would be instantly and legally seized by his aggressive commercial creditors the exact second his final paycheck hit his frozen bank account. I glanced at the dual-screen monitor setup on my expansive desk. The synchronization of these two massive events was not a mere coincidence. It was a perfectly timed, meticulously calculated masterstroke of absolute professional and personal destruction. On the left monitor, the secure corporate virtual meeting room was quietly loading, preparing to connect the Swiss executive board with the American legal team, prominently featuring Jamal. On the right monitor, a separate, highly secure video link was blinking steadily. It was the official international divorce mediation hearing scheduled by the Zurich Cantonal Court for the exact same hour. In his high-rise Chicago office, Jamal adjusted his bespoke silk tie and logged into the corporate portal, ready to charm the elusive European buyers and cement his partner status. He instructed his secretary to hold all personal calls explicitly, stating he was not to be interrupted under any circumstances. He wanted to project absolute focus and unquestionable dominance. 2 floors below him, in a different building, Brandon stood up and smoothed his suit jacket as the human resources director called his name for his final executive interview. He flashed his signature arrogant smile, fully preparing to charm his way into a massive corporate salary that would magically erase his secret second mortgage and the catastrophic foreclosure looming over his head. I adjusted the collar of my tailored blazer, taking a deep, satisfying breath of the crisp, alpine air filtering through my office window. Both men were stepping willingly into a beautifully constructed digital slaughterhouse. They were walking into separate rooms, entirely convinced of their own undeniable superiority, completely unaware that I controlled the locks on both doors. I moved my ergonomic mouse and simultaneously clicked the green button to join both high-definition video feeds. The unparalleled financial reckoning they had proudly earned was finally here. I was going to execute it with absolute flawless precision. I focused my attention on the right monitor first, where the official Zurich Cantonal Court seal illuminated the screen. The Swiss magistrate, a stern man with impeccably silver hair, formally opened the preliminary divorce mediation session. Felix sat quietly beside me at my mahogany desk, his posture radiating the serene confidence of a legal shark who had already tasted blood in the water. On the other end of the secure connection, the digital feed split into 2 separate high-definition windows. In the first window, Jamal appeared from his lavish Chicago office. He repeatedly checked his expensive watch, clearly agitated that this petty domestic dispute was cutting perilously close to his highly anticipated corporate merger call. In the second window, Brandon connected via his smartphone. He was hiding in the plush executive waiting area of his office building, whispering frantically into his wireless earbuds so his passing colleagues would not overhear his divorce proceedings. He looked sweaty, but painfully smug, entirely convinced he was about to strong-arm me into a massive financial settlement right before walking into his promotion interview. The magistrate prompted the parties to present their initial motions. Jamal immediately seized the floor, projecting his booming voice through his high-end desktop microphone. Your Honor, my client formally requests an equitable division of all known marital assets, Jamal declared using his most intimidating courtroom cadence. Since the petitioner has maliciously abandoned the primary residence and left my client burdened with substantial joint liabilities, we demand a mandatory unsealing of her private accounts. Furthermore, we are legally claiming 50% ownership of the petitioner's freelance consulting business. We estimate her independent enterprise generates a modest but taxable income, and my client is fully entitled to half of that valuation to offset the massive financial distress she has intentionally caused. Brandon leaned directly into his phone camera, his eyes narrowed with pure greed. You owe me, Cassidy, he whispered aggressively. I paid for the roof over your head for 7 years while you played on your computer. I want half of every single penny you managed to scrape together. I am going to bleed your little business dry. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of defense. I simply gave Felix a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Felix pressed a key on his laptop, securely uploading a massive, heavily encrypted file directly into the court's digital evidence portal. The magistrate and Jamal both received the immediate notification. "We have no objection to full financial transparency, Your Honor," Felix stated smoothly, his Swiss accent adding an elegant layer of absolute authority. "We have just provided the court and opposing counsel with the fully certified, internationally audited valuation of my client's sole corporate enterprise. You will find the asset breakdown on page 4. I watched Jamal intently. I watched the exact second his perfectly manicured finger clicked the digital file open. I watched his dark eyes rapidly scan the introductory paragraphs. Then I watched his entire reality fracture. The arrogant, composed corporate lawyer suddenly stopped breathing. His jaw went entirely slack. He leaned so far forward that his forehead nearly touched his computer monitor, desperately trying to comprehend the astronomical numbers glowing brightly on his screen. "What is this?" Jamal choked out, all of his manufactured courtroom bravado completely evaporating. "This cannot be right. This is a typographical error." Brandon frowned, squinting at his tiny phone screen. "What does it say, Jamal? What is her little hobby worth?" "Read it." Jamal swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly through the microphone. He looked directly at the camera, sheer, unfiltered panic swimming in his eyes. "It is not a hobby, Brandon. It is a multinational holding company and a premier mergers and acquisitions consultancy firm. The total certified valuation is $150 million. Brandon physically jerked backward, dropping his smartphone onto his lap. The camera feed tumbled wildly before settling on an extreme, unflattering angle of his double chin. $150 million, Brandon gasped, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. He scrambled to pick up the phone, his face instantly transforming from shock into absolute euphoric greed. He thought he had just won the ultimate lottery. He thought his financial apocalypse was miraculously canceled. "Jamal, take it. Take all of it. Demand $75 million right now. I am rich. I am completely set for life." Brandon was practically hyperventilating with joy. He was already mentally paying off his massive suburban foreclosure, rescuing his downtown luxury condo, and buying back his 24-year-old mistress. He thought he had struck absolute gold. I allowed him to enjoy his delusion for exactly 10 seconds. The fall from that height was going to shatter every single bone in his ego. "Upload the second exhibit," Felix had commanded softly. Felix tapped his keyboard again. A second document appeared in the court portal. Jamal frantically clicked it open, his eyes desperately searching for a legal avenue to secure his brother-in-law's newfound fortune, which would inevitably secure his own massive legal fee. But as Jamal read the title of the newly uploaded document, the last remaining trace of color completely vanished from his face. He slumped back into his expensive leather chair, utterly defeated. "What is it now?" Jamal Brandon demanded, impatiently, vibrating with manic energy. "Tell the judge I want my $75 million immediately. You are getting absolutely nothing." "Brandon?" Jamal whispered, his voice completely devoid of life. "You signed a post-nuptial agreement." Brandon froze. "What are you talking about?" "I never signed a post-nup. She is forging documents again." I leaned toward my camera, making sure my face filled his entire screen. "I did not forge a single thing, Brandon. Let us take a brief trip down memory lane to this past April. Tax season. You were incredibly stressed about missing your golf tournament because I asked you to review our joint federal filings. I handed you a thick stack of complex, incredibly boring financial paperwork. I placed those handy little yellow sticky notes exactly where you needed to sign." I watched the horrifying realization slowly dawn on Brandon's sweating face. "You hate domestic paperwork, Brandon," I reminded him ruthlessly. "You always claimed your brain was far too taxed by your extremely important mid-level management job to read what you were signing." Buried perfectly within those dense tax documents was a highly sophisticated ironclad post-nuptial agreement drafted by my elite legal team. It explicitly and permanently waived your right to any current or future business assets, offshore trusts, or corporate holdings belonging to me. You happily signed away your right to $150 million so you would not miss your tea time. Jamal buried his face in his hands, completely humiliated by his client's staggering incompetence. Brandon sat in the executive waiting room, clutching his phone with white knuckles, utterly destroyed. He was legally blocked from the greatest fortune he had ever seen, trapped with massive toxic debt, and staring directly at the woman he had severely underestimated for 7 long years. Brandon's voice suddenly echoed through the high-definition digital feed, sounding incredibly shrill and frantic. "This is fraud. Tell the judge this is blatant fraud, Jamal. She cannot just slip a multi-million-dollar legal contract into a stack of tax returns. That has to be illegal. It has to be." Jamal did not respond immediately. His dark eyes were glued to his monitor, rapidly reading through the digital pages of the post-nuptial agreement. I watched his panicked face closely. As a highly trained corporate lawyer, Jamal knew a bulletproof contract when he saw one. He was desperately looking for a loophole, a missing initial, an improper date, a vaguely worded clause that could miraculously invalidate the entire document in an Illinois court. He found absolutely nothing. I had paid top-tier international legal experts to ensure that every single paragraph, every comma, and every subsection was flawlessly executed. Jamal Brandon screamed, completely losing his composure in the executive waiting area. Several well-dressed corporate employees turned to stare at him, but he was far too hysterical to care about public appearances anymore. "Do your job. Tell the magistrate to throw it out right now." Jamal finally looked up, his expression, a complex mixture of profound exhaustion and intense professional embarrassment. "I cannot tell the magistrate that Brandon Jamal," said his deep voice heavy with absolute defeat. "She did not just slip a paper into a stack. This document has your verified notarized signature on every single page. It includes a specific bolded waiver of independent legal counsel. You explicitly signed an affidavit stating you were given the opportunity to have a lawyer review this document, and you voluntarily chose to decline." "I thought it was an IRS form." Brandon pleaded, his face pressed so close to his phone camera that I could vividly see the sweat beading on his forehead. "She told me it was tax paperwork." "That is deception. It is gross negligence on your part," I interjected smoothly, leaning forward and resting my hands on my desk. "Ignorance of what you are signing is not a valid legal defense in the United States, nor is it a defense in Switzerland. Furthermore, if you look at page 12, you will see a fully itemized disclosure of my financial assets at the exact time of signing. The total valuation of my company, the offshore trust's everything, was listed in plain black and white. You literally signed directly underneath a paragraph that declared you had reviewed my financial disclosures and waived all rights to them. All you had to do was read the paper in front of your face." The Swiss magistrate, who had been listening to the exchange with stoic professional neutrality, finally spoke. "Does the respondent's counsel have any valid legal grounds to contest the authenticity of this post-nuptial agreement under the current jurisdiction?" Jamal closed his eyes for a brief second, physically pained by the devastating admission he was forced to make on a recorded international court line. "No, Your Honor. The respondent cannot contest the authenticity of the signatures at this time." "You are firing yourself. As my lawyer," Brandon yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "You are supposed to be family, Jamal. You are supposed to protect me from this psycho." "I am trying to protect my own legal license, you absolute fool!" Jamal snapped back, his temper finally boiling over. "If I present a baseless fraud claim to an international court on a notarized flawless contract just because you were too incredibly lazy to read it, I will be sanctioned. You legally surrendered your right to her assets. It is completely done." Brandon collapsed backward against the plush waiting room chair, his breathing shallow and rapid. He stared blankly at his phone, his eyes wide and unfocused. The grand illusion of his sudden $75 million windfall had evaporated as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a terrifying gaping void. He was slowly beginning to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his mistake. He had treated our marriage, our finances, and my intelligence with absolute contempt. He had spent years treating me like a glorified administrative assistant, handing me the mental load of our entire household while he played the role of the important breadwinner. He had weaponized his incompetence, and I had simply used it to secure my financial empire. Let us carefully review your current reality, Brandon, I said, ensuring my voice remained remarkably calm and steady. You are completely cut off from my $150 million net worth. You are facing a hard, aggressive bank foreclosure on your primary residence because you stopped paying the mortgage. Your private checking account is completely frozen. You owe an astronomical amount of money on a downtown luxury condo you bought for a 24-year-old girl named Amber, who has already locked you out. You have zero equity, zero liquid cash, and your credit score is about to plummet into the dark ages. The only thing you currently possess is the suit on your back and the upcoming promotion interview you are desperately waiting for. I watched Brandon swallow hard. He instinctively glanced around the corporate waiting area, suddenly remembering exactly where he was. He desperately needed that promotion. He needed that executive salary to even attempt to dig himself out of the catastrophic financial grave he had dug. He tried to pull his shoulders back, attempting to muster a single shred of his usual arrogance. You can keep your secret money, Cassidy, Brandon spat, trying to sound defiant. I do not need it. I am walking into an interview for Senior Regional Director in 10 minutes. I am going to double my salary. I will get a massive signing bonus. I will pay off the bank, keep the condo, and move on with my life. You think you ruined me? But I am a top-tier executive. I will bounce back. You are just a bitter ex-wife hiding in Europe. I smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of my lips. It was the exact response I had anticipated. Brandon was clinging to his corporate identity as his final life raft. He truly believed his career was the one thing I could not touch. He believed his professional world was completely insulated from my strategic reach. Are you absolutely certain about that? Brandon, I asked softly. Jamal, who had been staring silently at his screen, suddenly perked up. He recognized the shift in my tone. It was the precise tone of a corporate predator preparing to drop the final fatal blow. What are you planning? Cassidy, Jamal demanded, his voice laced with sudden apprehension. He knew I had just dismantled his brother-in-law. He did not yet realize that I was about to dismantle him too. I believe we have concluded the asset division portion of this mediation, Your Honor, I said, addressing the Swiss magistrate. The petitioner officially submits the post-nuptial agreement into the permanent record. The magistrate nodded solemnly. The formal agreement is fully accepted. The court will proceed with finalizing the uncontested asset division as outlined today. I turned my attention back to the dual-screen monitor. Good luck in your interview, Brandon, I said, my voice dripping with lethal sweetness. I am sure the executive board will find your presentation highly illuminating. I ended the Zoom connection to the Zurich court, leaving both Brandon and Jamal staring at a blank screen. I swiveled my leather chair toward the left monitor, where the secure corporate virtual meeting room was already live and waiting. It was time for the ultimate corporate takeover. The digital waiting room for the international merger finalization call transitioned into a live grid of high-definition video feeds. My Swiss corporate board members occupied the top row, all wearing immaculate business attire and projecting an aura of absolute financial dominance. On the bottom row sat the executive leadership team of Brandon's employer, the mid-tier American software company we were aggressively acquiring. Right in the center of the American legal representation was Jamal. He had just switched over from our disastrous divorce mediation. His bespoke navy suit suddenly looked slightly rumpled. He was sweating visibly under the harsh fluorescent lights of his downtown Chicago office. He took a deep breath, forcefully adjusting his tie, desperately attempting to completely compartmentalize the brutal legal defeat he had just suffered on behalf of his brother-in-law. He was ready to charm the elusive European buyers and secure his highly coveted promotion to senior partner at his law firm. He had absolutely no idea he was stepping directly onto a meticulously armed landmine. Good morning to our American colleagues, announced Henrik, the senior managing partner of my Swiss firm. His crisp accent commanded immediate silence across the digital conference room. Today marks the formal execution of our majority stakeholder buyout. We have thoroughly reviewed the final transition documents provided by your external legal counsel. Before we proceed with the formal signatures, I would like to officially introduce our Director of Global Strategy and the newly appointed president of this subsidiary holding, who will be personally overseeing the entire corporate restructuring process. I reached forward and clicked the button to activate my high-resolution web camera. My video feed illuminated the center of the screen. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, my hands folded perfectly on my mahogany desk, radiating cold, absolute authority. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice smooth and razor-sharp. "I look forward to an incredibly efficient transition." I watched Jamal's video square with predatory focus. The exact second my face appeared on the main broadcast, Jamal physically recoiled. His eyes widened to an almost comical degree. His mouth fell open completely, abandoning his carefully practiced corporate stoicism. He leaned so close to the monitor that his forehead nearly touched the glass, blinking rapidly, as if trying to clear a bizarre hallucination. He had just spent the last hour aggressively mocking my freelance consulting business on a divorce mediation call. Now the very same woman was staring back at him as the supreme executive architect of the largest corporate buyout his law firm had handled all year. "Cassidy," Jamal gasped, his voice completely stripping away any professional decorum. His microphone picked up the raw, unfiltered shock in his tone. "What are you doing on this secure corporate channel?" The American software executives exchanged highly confused glances. The senior managing partner of Jamal's own law firm, who was also logged into the call, frowned deeply. "Jamal, do you know the new president of the holding company?" The senior partner asked, his tone laced with immediate suspicion. I offered a perfectly calibrated, entirely ruthless smile. "Yes, Arthur," I answered, addressing Jamal's boss directly by his first name. "Jamal and I are actually quite familiar with each other. In fact, we were just on a separate video call less than 5 minutes ago, regarding a highly sensitive family matter. You see, Jamal is legally married to my soon-to-be ex-husband's sister. We are family." The silence that violently crashed down on the virtual meeting was absolutely deafening. The American executives looked completely paralyzed. But it was Arthur, the senior law partner, whose face turned a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. In the high-stakes world of corporate mergers and acquisitions, failure to disclose a direct familial relationship with the opposing party is not just a minor oversight. It is a catastrophic, fatal ethical violation. It completely compromises the legal integrity of the entire multi-million-dollar transaction. Jamal Arthur growled, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly quiet register. "Is this true? Are you legally related to the lead acquisition strategist of the purchasing firm? And did you deliberately fail to disclose this massive conflict of interest during the due diligence phase?" Jamal looked like he was going to vomit. He tugged at his silk tie as if it were physically strangling him. "Arthur, I swear to you I had absolutely no idea she was involved with this European holding company. She told everyone she was a freelance consultant. She lied to us. I did not know she was the buyer." "Ignorance is not a valid legal defense, Jamal," I interjected, deliberately throwing his exact words from our previous encounter directly back into his face. "As the lead external counsel for the selling entity, it was your absolute fiduciary duty to conduct a thorough background investigation into the acquiring corporate officers. If you had bothered to do the most basic level of professional due diligence, instead of blindly trusting your own arrogant assumptions about my intelligence, you would have seen my name listed on the Swiss corporate registry months ago. You failed your client, you failed your firm, and you have severely violated American Bar Association ethical guidelines." I watched Jamal visibly shrink into his leather chair. The realization of his complete professional destruction was hitting him like a physical blow. By representing the acquired company while his brother-in-law was actively seeking a massive executive promotion within that exact same company, and while his sister-in-law was the ultimate buyer, he had orchestrated a nightmare scenario of insider trading implications and ethical breaches. His entire career was built on projecting dominance and infallibility, and I had just exposed him as a grossly negligent, incompetent amateur in front of his most important clients and his boss. "We take corporate compliance incredibly seriously," Henrik added, backing my play flawlessly. Our firm was completely unaware that the American legal representation had failed to disclose this conflict. "Madam President, how do you advise we proceed with this compromised situation?" I kept my eyes locked directly on Jamal's panicked, sweating face. Given the severe ethical violations demonstrated by the current external counsel, I cannot authorize the final transfer of funds while this specific attorney remains attached to the contract. The liability is far too great. I formally request that Arthur immediately remove Jamal from this account and launch a full internal audit of his communications. Furthermore, to ensure absolute operational efficiency within the newly acquired subsidiary, we must immediately execute the planned structural reorganization of all mid-level management personnel across the entire board. Jamal covered his mouth with a shaking hand. He suddenly realized the dual nature of my attack. I was not just ending his career trajectory. I was simultaneously dropping the corporate guillotine directly on Brandon's neck. Jamal knew Brandon was currently sitting in a waiting room 2 floors below, desperately expecting a massive promotion that would magically save him from an aggressive banking foreclosure and total bankruptcy. He knew I held the exact unchecked power to terminate that position instantly. He had gleefully helped his arrogant brother-in-law humiliate me, and in return I had successfully maneuvered them both onto the exact same chopping block. Arthur did not hesitate for a single second. The senior partner glared through the screen with absolute, unfiltered fury. "Jamal, you are entirely removed from this merger effective immediately. Log off the secure channel, pack your desk, and wait for a formal summons from the Ethics Committee. We will be conducting a complete, exhaustive investigation into your gross malpractice." Jamal opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate a defense, a plea, any possible excuse to save his crumbling corporate identity. He looked at me, his dark eyes pleading for the exact same mercy he had ruthlessly denied me just hours prior. I offered him absolutely nothing but a cold, dismissive stare. Defeated, humiliated, and completely destroyed. Jamal slowly reached forward and disconnected from the call. His high-resolution video feed vanished, leaving a black, empty square in his wake. I calmly adjusted my tailored blazer, turning my attention back to the remaining highly intimidated executives on the screen. Now that the legal liability has been appropriately removed, I stated crisply, "Let us proceed with the immediate termination of the redundant American management staff. Let us begin directly with the Regional Project Management Department." The Human Resources Director on the bottom row of the video grid shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the conference room door. He had clearly received the internal memo regarding the hostile buyout, but was utterly unprepared for the immediate surgical precision of the new president's restructuring agenda. He stammered slightly as he reached for the personnel file he had placed on the table just minutes before the meeting began. It was the file containing the final recommendations for the senior regional director position. Brandon, who was currently sitting in the lobby outside this very office, was completely oblivious to the fact that his career was being deleted in real time. He was still mentally reviewing his rehearsed speech about regional growth, unaware that the human resources director under my direct command was now authorized to bypass every single standard corporate procedure. "Proceed?" I said, my voice echoing with a cold professional finality that left no room for hesitation. "I require a complete list of the candidates being proposed for termination. I want the immediate removal of all redundant management staff, starting with the Regional Projects Department." The HR director's hand trembled as he pulled out the document. He cleared his throat, his face pale against the backdrop of the sterile corporate wall. "Well, currently the firm is preparing to finalize the senior regional director promotion. We have Brandon Anderson as the top-ranking internal applicant. His interview is scheduled to commence at any moment." "Terminate him," I replied, not breaking eye contact with the camera. I want his access badges deactivated, his corporate email wiped, and his network permissions revoked before he even enters that interview room. I do not care about the promotion process. I care about operational efficiency. His department is redundant under our new structure. The American leadership team exchanged frantic, panicked glances. Brandon was a popular figure among the mid-level staff. He was known for his boisterous personality and his ability to leverage his connections to secure short-term gains. One of the senior American partners attempted to intervene. "Madam President, if I may, Mr. Anderson has been with the company for 8 years. He has a solid internal track record." Abruptly terminating him without a formal performance review or standard severance negotiation could significantly impact staff morale. I leaned forward, my gaze hardening. Morale is not a metric I am currently tracking. I am tracking the profitability of this subsidiary. Your current management team has allowed bloat and inefficiency to fester for far too long. Brandon Anderson represents exactly the kind of stagnancy we intend to purge. If the American leadership team is incapable of executing a simple workforce rationalization, I will send a Swiss team to your office tomorrow to handle the entire department personally. Are we clear? The senior partner lowered his head, finally grasping the true nature of the woman who had just acquired his company. "Yes, Madam President, we are clear." "We are." I watched as the HR director stood up and walked out of the conference room, presumably to escort Brandon to the end of his career. I could envision the scene perfectly. Brandon would be sitting in the waiting area, likely checking his watch and adjusting his tie one last time, feeling entirely confident about the lucrative salary increase he was minutes away from securing. He would stand up when he saw the HR director approaching, perhaps expecting a firm handshake and a congratulatory welcome into the executive fold. Instead, he would be met with a cold, formal request to follow the director into a private room. I did not need to be physically present to know the exact look of confusion and subsequent horror that would cross his face when the termination letter was placed in his hands. I knew the exact sequence of events that would follow. The moment he attempted to log into his corporate portal to check his bank balance, he would find his credentials locked. He would try to reach his internal contacts only to realize his communication channels had been severed. The devastating reality of his professional death would be compounded by the fact that it was happening precisely when he was at his most arrogant and overconfident. The HR director returned to the conference room 10 minutes later, his face grim and tight. He sat down and nodded once toward the camera. "The termination is complete. His belongings have been collected by security, and his access is entirely revoked." He attempted to argue, but the security team escorted him from the premises before he could cause a scene. He seemed completely bewildered by the suddenness of it all. "Good," I said, maintaining my professional mask while inwardly savoring the absolute ruin of the man who had discarded me. "Continue with the remaining personnel reductions." While the meeting dragged on into the afternoon, focusing on the complex logistical details of the corporate integration, my mind occasionally drifted to the suburban house. By now, the foreclosure notice would be reaching its final stages. Brandon had just lost his primary source of income. He had no savings, no liquid assets, and a massive debt load that was about to be accelerated by his primary lender. He had no wife to bail him out, and no brother-in-law to manipulate the legal system for him. He was effectively alone. The corporate guillotine I had just dropped was not just about professional retribution. It was the final inevitable conclusion to the path he had chosen. He had built his life on the foundation of my success while actively undermining my worth, and now that the foundation was gone, his entire existence was collapsing under its own weight. I watched the American executives continue their presentations, their voices slightly more subdued, their focus entirely dedicated to proving their own utility in the new corporate hierarchy. They were finally learning what it meant to operate under a leadership that valued objective performance and absolute accountability over ego politics and the illusion of prestige. As the virtual call concluded and the screen faded to black, I took a deep, steadying breath. The corporate restructuring would continue for several more weeks, ensuring every vestige of the old inefficient management was purged, but for today, the primary objective had been achieved. Brandon Anderson had been stripped of his status, his career, and his financial stability. He was exactly where he had put me 2 years ago, alone, powerless, and facing the consequences of his own calculated decisions. I stood up and walked to the window, the panoramic view of Zurich gleaming with the potential of a future I had finally reclaimed. I had not just survived his betrayal, I had risen far above it, transforming his catastrophic attempt to destroy me into a masterclass on how to build an empire on your own terms. The ashes of his arrogance were still smoldering, and I was just getting started. Back in Chicago, the fallout of my orchestrated strike was spectacularly brutal. When Brandon finally pulled his least luxury sedan into his mother's suburban driveway, he was a completely broken man. He dragged himself through the front door, still clutching the cardboard box containing his meager desk supplies, only to walk directly into an absolute war zone. Jamal had arrived at the house 20 minutes prior, pacing the living room floor like a caged animal. The moment Brandon stepped into the foyer, Jamal aggressively threw his leather briefcase violently against the wall. He did not care about Brandon's obvious devastation or his sudden lack of employment. He only cared that his own pristine corporate reputation was completely in ruins. "You incredibly stupid, arrogant parasite," Jamal roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at Brandon's chest. "You cost me my senior partnership. Arthur just suspended me pending a full ethical review because of your absolute failure to control your wife. I am facing a permanent disbarment in the state." Brandon dropped his cardboard box, the sound echoing hollowly in the tense room. "She fired me," Brandon whispered, his voice cracking with sheer disbelief. "Cassidy bought the company and fired me. I have absolutely nothing left." Brenda rushed into the room, her hands flying to her pale face. She looked at Jamal, expecting him to formulate a brilliant legal strategy to save her favorite son. "Jamal, you have to sue her," Brenda demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "You have to file an injunction. She cannot legally destroy a man's livelihood just out of spite." "I cannot do a single thing for you, Brenda," Jamal shouted, his dark eyes flashing with unfiltered hatred. "I am completely finished with this pathetic family. You raised a lazy, entitled fool who thought he could outsmart a global financial strategist. I am not losing my prestigious career because you coddled a loser." Samantha stepped forward, her allegiance shifting instantly. She had spent years riding the coattails of her mother's perceived superiority, but faced with the immediate loss of Jamal's massive corporate income, her survival instincts kicked in. She turned her back on her brother completely. "Jamal is absolutely right," Samantha snapped, glaring at Brandon with pure disgust. "You ruined your own life to chase a young mistress, and now you are dragging my husband down with you. You are a massive liability. Do not ever call us for money." Brenda gasped, clutching her chest as if physically wounded by her daughter's betrayal. "Samantha, how can you speak to your brother that way? He needs our support right now." "Support him yourself, Mom," Samantha shot back coldly. "You always thought he was the golden child. Now you get to feed him, house him, and pay his massive legal debts. Come on, Jamal. We are leaving." Brandon sank to the floor, weeping openly as his sister and brother-in-law violently slammed the front door. The incredibly toxic, broken family had finally completely consumed itself in the absolute dark. Exactly 3 weeks after the corporate slaughter, my encrypted business tablet chimed with an incoming communication. My robust digital filters had automatically routed it to a heavily monitored spam folder, but the sender's address was unmistakable. It was a message from Brandon. He had bypassed my cellular blockade by creating an entirely new anonymous email account from a public library computer, presumably because his own residential internet service had been promptly disconnected for non-payment. I opened the message while sitting comfortably on the sunlit terrace of my penthouse. The text was a pathetic, sprawling manifesto of manufactured remorse and desperate manipulation. He begged for my forgiveness. He claimed that losing his job, his house, and his mistress had finally forced him to realize how much he truly loved me. He pleaded for a second chance, swearing upon his life that he would change. He asked for emergency funds just to survive the upcoming month. At the very bottom of the long, tearful email, almost as an afterthought, he begged to see Leo. He tried to invoke his parental rights completely, forgetting that he had willingly signed them away to avoid missing a Sunday football game. I stared at the glowing screen for a long, quiet moment. I searched my chest for any lingering trace of anger, pity, or even mild sorrow. I found absolutely nothing but an impenetrable, pristine silence. He was a ghost from a past life I had successfully buried. Without typing a single word in response, I dragged the email directly into the digital trash bin and permanently deleted his account from my server. He did not deserve an explanation. He did not deserve a sliver of my attention. My absolute silence was the ultimate inescapable closure. That weekend, I took Leo on a highly anticipated trip to Geneva. We walked hand in hand along the immaculate promenade of Lake Geneva, the majestic jet d'eau shooting water high into the crystal-clear sky. Leo was laughing brightly, pointing at the white swans gliding gracefully across the pristine surface. He was safe, thriving, and completely insulated from the financial and emotional wreckage his father had selfishly created. I watched the bright sunlight dance across the calm water, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of absolute victory. I had spent 7 years shrinking my massive potential to protect the fragile ego of a small, insignificant man. I had endured the relentless insults of a highly toxic family because society dictated that successful women should always compromise their own brilliance for the sake of domestic peace. I would never shrink myself again. I had ruthlessly weaponized their own arrogance to dismantle their false empire, and in doing so, I had fully reclaimed my own. The cold wind blowing off the lake felt incredibly refreshing. I pulled my tailored coat tighter around my shoulders, smiling down at my son. We were entirely free, standing boldly at the absolute summit of a life I had masterfully engineered. Looking back at the rubble I left behind in Chicago, the most profound lesson I learned was never actually about the money or the corporate assets. It was entirely about the dangerous illusion of control. Brandon, Brenda, and Jamal genuinely believed that because I was quiet, I was inherently weak. They mistakenly assumed my willingness to compromise meant I completely lacked the capacity to fight back. They confused my deliberate patience for pathetic submission. What they failed to understand is that the most dangerous person in the room is never the one shouting the loudest or bragging about their perceived authority. The most dangerous person is the one quietly observing, collecting data, securing legal documentation, and calculating exactly how to dismantle the entire system the second it becomes absolutely necessary. For 7 long years, I allowed myself to be the designated scapegoat for a deeply broken family that measured human worth entirely by outward appearances. I let a profoundly mediocre man dictate my daily existence because society constantly trains successful women to make themselves intentionally smaller so the insecure men around them can feel significantly larger. We swallow our pride, we hide our hard-earned accomplishments, and we absorb their relentless insults under the false belief that it will somehow earn us domestic harmony. We quietly fix their terrible financial decisions to maintain a toxic peace. But true respect is never earned by shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's narrow worldview. It is demanded by standing unapologetically in your absolute truth. If my story can offer any real value to you right now, let it be a strict, necessary wake-up call. Do not ever apologize for your brilliance. Do not ever dim your light to keep a toxic partner or an abusive family comfortable in the dark. Your worth is not determined by their limited ability to recognize it. When someone hands you a vicious ultimatum designed to break your spirit, you do not have to cry, negotiate, or beg for mercy. You can simply look them dead in the eye, accept their challenge, and step aside to let them face the catastrophic consequences of their own staggering arrogance. Sometimes the absolute best revenge is a meticulous, legally binding exit strategy that leaves them holding the massive debt they tried to force over your head. Now I want to hear directly from you. Have you ever had to step away from a deeply toxic relationship and let the people who severely underestimated you completely burn their own lives to the ground? How did you find the strength to finally execute your escape plan and take your power back? Share your experiences in the comments below because your story might be the exact motivation someone else needs to finally walk out the door. If my journey resonated with you today, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of undeniable resilience and strategic triumph. Thank you for watching, and always remember, your peace is the most valuable asset you own. Protect it at all costs. The gripping story of Cassidy dismantling the fabricated life of her toxic husband offers a profound lesson on the true nature of boundaries and personal worth. For years, she minimized her own brilliance, hiding a massive corporate career and immense financial success just to protect the fragile ego of Brandon. This highlights a tragic reality: many successful individuals face the overwhelming societal pressure to actively shrink oneself to keep a deeply insecure partner comfortable. However, the ultimate takeaway is that enduring disrespect to maintain a false sense of domestic harmony is always a losing battle. When confronted with blatant disrespect, infidelity, and financial abuse, Cassidy did not resort to screaming matches, tearful pleas, or emotional outbursts. Instead, she chose a path of absolute calculated silence. Her journey teaches us that the most effective response to arrogance and manipulation is not a dramatic, tearful confrontation, but rather quiet, meticulous preparation. By keeping her emotions strictly in check, she was able to observe the fatal weaknesses of her opponents, specifically the weaponized incompetence of her husband and the blinding corporate hubris of his family. She brilliantly used their own blind spots to legally and financially secure her undeniable freedom. This compelling narrative powerfully reminds us that we are under no obligation to finance our own disrespect. It is incredibly dangerous to sacrifice our potential or hide our light for people who only value us when we are small, submissive, and easily controlled. True empowerment requires standing firmly in your authentic reality and establishing ironclad boundaries. We must learn to recognize toxic dynamics early and gather the resources needed to protect our peace, families, and futures without apology. Never hesitate to walk away from tables where respect is not served. Share this with anyone needing courage today.